Welcome to The Bitter Witness.
Don't be scared.
Hello, welcome back. I'm Rebecca, and I'm your host for The Bitter Witness. I hope you've had a good week. I took last week off as the production that I'm in had its opening weekend, and needless to say, the week was insanely busy, but the entire thing went off without a hitch. Okay, well maybe there was a few hitches, but in community theater, we just roll with the punches and carry on. Other than that, I really haven't done too much of anything, really. Theater has a tendency of taking over the majority of my life, especially when we get close to opening night. I have a sad update for you. Well, you may think it's sad. I, on the other hand, am fine with it and hold no guilt whatsoever. Marv and Marge have sadly left this plane of existence. Now, before all you PETA lovers come for me, it was an accident. Kind of. Well, it was, I guess you could say. My backyard is huge. It's really long, and a few years ago I removed a pool, and since then I really haven't done that much with it other than getting some fill for the hole. This year I hadn't been in the yard at all, and let's just say that Mother Nature was attempting to reclaim the property that is my yard. The weeds had overgrown to astronomical heights. I went out there and pulled a few, but in all honesty, it was taking hours, and I am one of the laziest people that I know. So I asked one of my boys, who is a landscaper, to bring home some Roundup, the weed killer. And he did. And he also brought his heavy-duty weed whacker with a metal blade home. And, well, anyway, long story short, squirrels and Roundup don't mix well, apparently. But in my defense, I didn't know that, and I didn't really think about it. So I hope that Marv and Marge have found a beautiful castle up in squirrel heaven, a place where they can stay for all of eternity, and that way they won't be in my fucking back room. A little side story to this, while the Roundup was on the backyard, we had to take Miley and Piper out front to relieve themselves for a few days. Miley is a red-tick coonhound, and I don't know if you've ever had a hound, but they are one of the most stubborn breeds of dogs, which is one of the reasons why I love her so much. Anyway, Miley is a fiercely private dog, and she only likes to relieve herself in her own yard. There are some walks that she won't even go pee. She'll literally wait until we get home and ask to go out back. So for 3 days, this stubborn dog didn't poo. She doesn't like being on display. She's quite the dog. Not Piper. You walk her out and bing bang boom, she's done all her business and even tried to spread it around with her back legs. Although she is never anywhere close to where she has left her little presents for me, but nonetheless, let's just say it was a frustrating 3 days while the Roundup was working its magic in the backyard. I must have taken that hound dog out 8 times a day and 0 poos. Well, that's enough of the animal updates for today. Let's get to the business, shall we? If you enjoy the show, please head over to our Patreon page. You can sign up there to support us. For a few cents a day, you will have access to the Bitter Bits, which are shorter episodes. Sometimes I discuss other crimes or things I find interesting. You can also subscribe on Spotify and support the show. You will also have access to the Bitter Bits there as well. And if you are listening on Apple, please give us a 5-star review. All of these things really help the show and allow me to continue to bring you these interesting cases and do what I love. With that, Miley and Piper are sleeping behind me, so Puppy ASMR will be brought to you by both dogs today. Grab a cup of tea, sit back, and relax while I tell you about the case of Flight 108 from Montreal and Marguerite Petrie, the last woman to be executed in Canada. As always, I want to give top billing to the victims in this case. So, to all 23 victims affected by this case, I acknowledge you and I send my love to you wherever you may be. Marguerite Petrie was born Marguerite Roost on September 5th, 1908. She was dubbed by the press as Madame Le Corbeau, which means Madame Raven in English, and they called her this because she always wore black clothes. She ran a boarding house in Quebec. There is not much else that we know about Marguerite Petrie. It was very hard to find any kind of information on this case. There was a lot of digging. We need to discuss Joseph Albert Guay. Guay, I think I'm saying that right. It could be Albert Guy or Gay or Albert Guay. I don't know, but he's French, so I'm going to go with Albert Guay. But the guy's a dick, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time worrying about getting his name right. He was born September 23rd in 1918 in Quebec, Canada. His family moved to Quebec City, where he grew up in one of the roughest neighborhoods at the time, known as Basse-Ville. A neighbor of Guay's, Roger Lemelin, who went on to considerable fame as one of Quebec's best-known and most loved novelists, called the people of Basse-Ville the mud of society. For most of his life, Guay was a small-time hustler with a very high opinion of himself. He was a master manipulator who liked to dress sharp and put on an air of importance that was way higher than what he really was. In French-speaking Quebec, where double-barreled first names were the norm, he decided to call himself J. Albert Guay, because he felt it sounded classier and more important than Joseph Albert, and just the kind of mysterious name someone from the higher echelons of society might take interest in, or have themselves. There was a story in the New Yorker from 1953 written by E.J. Kahn that I used heavily in this story. According to this story, Albert had an ambition to become a singer and an orchestra leader. But I didn't find that anywhere else. That was the only place I saw that, so take that with a grain of salt. So during the war years, the 20-something Albert, we're going to call him Albert, took a job at the massive government munitions factory known as l'Arsenal de Saint-Malo in Quebec City. While working there, he had many side hustles going, and one of them was selling watches of shit quality to coworkers. I just imagine this asshole with a trench coat opening it up with a whole bunch of watches hanging on it, because I would just love to actually see someone who does that, just once. He was a familiar figure in pool halls in his neighborhood, where he earned $1 here and $1 there from selling watches and jewelry. He did well enough with this little side hustle of jewelry selling to buy himself a car. And the age-old story, all the young ladies in the factory thought he was very dashing and handsome and mysterious and wanted to date him. Girls, don't date the asshats. Go for someone nice. It will pay off in the end, I swear. There were hundreds of young women that worked at this munitions factory. He always put a lot of effort into his image, and he always dressed in fancy suits and drove his big Mercury around the narrow streets of Quebec City. And in August of 1941, he married a young woman named Rita Morale, who also worked in the armory. In 1945, the couple had a child, a daughter named Lise. With the end of the war, both Albert and Rita found themselves out of work. So Albert decided to turn his little side hustle of selling jewelry into a full-time business. So he set up a jewelry and watch repair business in his neighborhood. But Albert was not happy with his wife's new and complete focus on Lise. He wasn't getting all of her attention any longer. He was jealous of his baby, and he started his philandering ways. And at one point, he met a 17-year-old cocktail waitress from a club in Quebec City by the name of Marie-Ange Robitaille. Marie-Ange knew exactly who Albert was, and she knew that he was married. Marie-Ange told family and friends that Albert's name was Roger Angers, and that he was 19 years old and single. After a year or so, Albert began calling on Marie-Ange at her parents' home several evenings a week. He gave Marie-Ange a ring and promised her he would leave his wife and get a divorce. As always, Rita found out about the little affair. Everyone else in town already knew, but Rita was the last to find out, and confronted Marie-Ange at her parents' home in November of 1948. After a huge dramatic scene, Marie-Ange was kicked out of her house. Her parents wanted nothing to do with her. So she went to Albert for help. He set her up in a rooming house run by Marguerite Petrie, and there they continued their illicit affair. This guy was an absolute piece of dirt. Now, at this time in Quebec, the majority of the province was predominantly Roman Catholic, and, well, let's just say that divorce and adultery were not something that representatives from the church were willing to entertain. But Albert had promised Marie-Ange that he would divorce his wife, and he was hitting a lot of roadblocks trying to get that done. Marie-Ange decided she had waited long enough and decided to break things off with Albert. But because Albert was such a shit stain on the shorts of life, Marie-Ange trying to leave only enraged him, and he was able to stop her every time. One time he pulled a gun on her and told her he would kill her and himself if she left. In the winter of 1949, Marie-Ange tried to escape again and flee to Montreal, but he was able to catch her before she got on the plane. He took away her coat and burned her gloves, and then he bit her on the face, causing a huge wound. He said that he had hoped it would make her ashamed to go out in public with that mark on her face. And if you know Canada, it is fucking cold here in the winter. You need a coat and gloves. What an absolute dick fuck. God, this guy, I hate him so much. By the summer of 1949, Rita and Lise had moved in with Rita's mother, and Marie-Ange had pretty much cut all her relations off with Albert. Somehow, Albert wormed his way back into the lives of both women, and that is where he began to plot the murder of his wife Rita. Now remember that Marie-Ange is living in Marguerite Petrie's boarding house. As well, Marguerite has a brother, I think it's Jean Roost, who was disabled from tubercular paralysis. And he actually works for Albert as a watch repairman at Albert's jewelry store. In April of 1949, Marie-Ange had tried to escape with no luck, and Albert was not getting a divorce from Rita because the church would not allow it. And Albert decided that the only way to get free of his marital ties was to murder Rita. First, he offered a friend $500 to poison Rita's food, but the friend refused to have anything to do with it. Then inspiration hit Albert on May 7th, 1949, when a passenger plane exploded and crashed into the sea near the Philippines. It was the first recorded instance of airline sabotage. This is what they called it at the time because the term terrorism didn't come along for quite a few years. This plane that crashed near the Philippines was taken out by a time bomb planted by a wife who, with the help of a number of ex-cons, was trying to get rid of her husband. The case made news around the globe, but she was never brought to trial. Albert, seeing this in the newspaper, approached his very good friend Jean Roux, Marguerite's brother. He couldn't really do any of the legwork, but he agreed to build the bomb for Albert if Albert would give him a good discount on a ring that he was coveting in the jewelry store. Albert agreed. So apparently because Jean Roux was a clockmaker, that automatically made him an expert in bomb making. So watch out for those clockmakers, people. They not only have the elves, but the bombs too. Who knew? Then Albert went to Marguerite. He enlisted her help by agreeing to wipe out the debt of a large amount of money that she owed to Albert. The three put their heads together and started to try and come up with a plan. This is all according to news reports, which were based on evidence that was presented at trial, which was pretty much just what Albert was telling the court. So we kind of have to take this with a large bucket of salt. At first, Albert testified that Marguerite suggested that the trio enlist the help of a friend who was a taxi driver. She suggested they place the bomb inside the trunk of the cab, and then, when Albert and Rita were riding in the cab, have the driver pull over saying something was wrong with the taxi, and have the two men get out and look under the hood. While they were safely out of the car, the bomb could go off and kill Rita. Albert and Genereux thought this was a good idea, but the taxi driver friend refused to participate in the plot. So back to the drawing board again. Eventually, Albert was able to talk Rita into taking a quick trip to Baie-Comeau, which is just a little village in Quebec. He told her he had 2 suitcases stored there full of jewelry, and he needed her to go get them and bring them back. On September 9th, in the morning, a woman dressed all in black entered the Saint Foy airport with a package that she was sending by airmail. The package was accepted and loaded into the cargo hold of the plane, which Rita was scheduled to be on in just a few hours. Rita boarded the plane, and on September 9th, 1949, Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 108 from Montreal to Baie-Comeau, Quebec, with a stopover in Quebec City, exploded over Sault-au-Cochon, Quebec, killing all 23 on board. The plane was taking off from Saint Foy Airport in Quebec City. This was the stopover of the flight. The plane took off from Quebec City at 10:29 a.m., which was about 5 minutes late. At 10:45 a.m., the plane exploded and fell from the sky. Also, on that same day, earlier in the morning, Albert had taken out a $10,000 insurance policy on Rita. Not suspicious at all. Apparently, I read in one of the articles that I used for this case that he bought it from a vending machine in the airport. I've never heard of buying life insurance from a vending machine, but we should Google it.
I am right behind you. Please stay.
Did you like that? That's my new I'm Googling something sound. So apparently they were a thing. They almost look like the old cigarette vending machines, and you could buy $5,000 of life insurance inside the airport from a vending machine for 25 cents. And every quarter you plugged into those vending machines added another $5,000 onto your policy. So for 50 cents, Albert bought a life insurance policy on Rita right before she got on her flight. Creepy. Very, very creepy. I probably would have bought it though, because I would have been too freaked out not to. A few weeks before September 9th, before Rita boarded Flight 108, Albert and Marie-Ange took the same flight from Quebec City up to Baie-Comeau and back again. Marie-Ange testified that they really didn't do anything in Baie-Comeau except go for dinner, then turn around and come back. But she said that while they were on the flight there, Albert kept looking at his watch and out the window. If the plane had taken off on time, it would have exploded and crashed into the St. Lawrence River. But because it was 5 minutes late, it didn't make it to the river. Almost, but not quite. Albert had planned to have the plane crash into the St. Lawrence River because he thought that if it went into the water, any forensic evidence that would tie him to the explosion would be wiped out by the water. He thought this because the woman in the Philippines was never convicted of anything, and that plane landed in the water. We're dealing with a genius, people. It really only took investigators a couple of days to realize that Flight 108 had been brought down by some type of explosion, and they were pretty sure that the bomb was located in the forward luggage compartment. While investigators were sifting through the wreckage, they found remnants of a time bomb inside the front cargo area of the plane. When they questioned airport employees, they remembered a nervous woman dressed all in black bringing in a package that morning for the flight. Investigators then interviewed taxi drivers. One of the taxi drivers didn't know the name of a woman that he had driven to and from the airport that day. The driver told the police he waited for her as she carried a package into the cargo office of the airport. He claimed that the woman had been overly careful with the package and had actually hit him and yelled at him about his driving. He was able to take the police to the neighborhood where he picked her up, and eventually the taxi driver spotted her coming out of her apartment building. The taxi driver gave the police the confirmation that this was the lady in his cab the day of the explosion. It was Marguerite. She told the police that her friend, Joseph Albert Guay, had asked her to deliver the heavy yet fragile parcel to the airport and put it on the flight to Baie-Comeau. Marguerite told the police that she didn't know what was in the package and had actually thought that it was a religious statue of some sort. Another little tidbit that the investigators found was that on September 11th, just 2 days after the crash, Albert tried to cash in the life insurance policy he had taken out on Rita just 2 days before. And here we see the dawn of a new typology of criminal. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the dumb shit criminal. We're going to take a minute now and identify and acknowledge the victims of Flight 108. There were 23 victims in all that were killed in the explosion of Flight 108. The aircraft commander, or the pilot, for Flight 108 was Captain Pierre Lauren of Montreal. He was a 30-year-old father whose wife was expecting their second child in just a few days. He was one of the original Canadian Pacific Airline pilots of 1942. Next, we have the second pilot, Gordon Alexander. He held a commercial pilot's license since 1936 and had accumulated over 4,000 hours of flying time. He was born in Ontario, and he was at the time living with his wife and 2-year-old son Bruce in Verdun, a suburb of Montreal. I think I said that right. It could be Verdun. His wife Margaret had been an air traffic controller during the Second World War. On Flight 108, the flight engineer was Emile Therian. He was a 6-year veteran of the Royal Canadian Air Force. Emile was a maintenance engineer mechanic who traveled with the Canadian Pacific Airline flights to remote destinations to deal with maintenance issues when they happened way up north. He was married with 2 sons, Pierre, 5, and Michel, 4, and lived in Montreal. Today, we use the term flight attendant, but when this murder took place, they used the term stewardess. On this flight, the stewardess was Miss Gertrude, or Trudy, McKay from Lethbridge, Alberta. Trudy had joined the airline after the death of her war veteran husband in an automobile accident 3 years previously. She had moved to Montreal with the company the previous year and shared an apartment with a friend who worked in the control tower at Dorval Airport. That is the airport where this flight had originated that morning. She had been off sick for a couple of weeks and had just returned from leave that week. Also on the plane were 3 business executives, Earl Stannard, Russ Parker, and Arthur Stork. They had boarded in Montreal, and so they were already on the plane and in their seats when it arrived at St. Foy Airport. All were employed with the Kennecott Copper Corporation, one of the world's largest mining corporations. The 3 men were on their way to Baie-Comeau. Earl was about to retire, Russ was going to be taking the helm of the corporation, and Arthur was accompanying and assisting the executives as they visited the company's new mining assets along the North Shore. Then we have 24-year-old Lionel Dallaire, a garage station owner from the village of Chute-aux-Outards. He was returning home after combining a visit with his sister in Montreal and a non-emergency appendectomy. Businessmen Cecil Humphreys and Alfonso Keller were both inspectors with the Bank of Montreal. They had also boarded in Montreal. Bill Schular and Ed Calnan from the Ontario Paper Company. A 32-year-old Monsieur Henri-Paul Bouchard, his wife, and their infant child. In 1949, infants were carried by their parents and were not listed on the manifests of airplanes. They were returning home to Baie-Comeau after a holiday with family in Sorel. Sitting alone in one row was 47-year-old Beatrice Furlot, a widow from Broadlands, Quebec. She was coming from a visit to her sister near Montreal and on her way to Baie-Comeau to see more relatives. 37-year-old Madame Romeo Chapadeau, with her 11-month-old baby boy in her arms, and her two other children, 14-year-old Florette and 13-year-old Jean-Claude, boarded the plane at Saint Foy Airport. Madame R. Durette of Bay Trinité was also on the plane. As well, Harold S. Pye, who was a high school gym teacher in Lennoxville, Quebec, also boarded at Saint Foy Airport. And lastly, Madame Rita Guay. So those are the 23 victims that were on this plane that Albert, Marguerite, and Jeannot decided to explode so that Albert could continue and marry his mistress, Marie-Ange. After the crash, the body of Henri Bouchard, he was on the plane with his wife and baby, was not immediately found within the wreckage, but it was located on September 16th, about 300 feet from the wreckage. His body was found by a search team made up of family and friends. The investigators never gave reason for not finding his body, as it was within the cordoned-off area of the crash, and this area had been searched for quite a few days by the investigative team, and they just missed him. At the funeral of the Chapadeau family, Mrs. Chapadeau and her 11-month-old son were buried together. Her son was in her arms just as they were found in the wreckage of the plane. At Rita Guay's funeral at St. Roch Church in Rue St. Joseph, her husband, Albert Shitstain, put on a tearful show of grief, and according to a 1953 story in The New Yorker, purchased a 5-foot cross of red roses with a heart of white roses at the center, which bore the inscription, "From your beloved Albert." What an absolute piece of dirt. He put on this huge show at her funeral from him and his daughter, and he cared enough about his daughter to do that. But he didn't care about all the other children, innocent children that were on that plane that he murdered. Asshole. And now we're going to get into the arrests and the trials. Police have already questioned Marguerite, and she told them that her friend Albert Guay gave her a package to put on that plane, and she thought it was some kind of religious statue or something. The police went to arrest Petrie, and when they arrived, they found her semi-conscious, following an overdose of sleeping pills. Albert had provided them for her and told her she had to kill herself because she was about to be blamed for the entire explosion. Marguerite survived her overdose, but at the time, attempted suicide was illegal, and she would be jailed and tried for that crime. The police conducted a search on Marguerite's boarding house, which is also where Jeannot was living. There, they found a small piece of corrugated cardboard with multiple perforations and a blackish substance on the cardboard. A chemical spectrographic analysis of the cardboard showed presence of two very fine copperish particles, and that metal, the copperish particles, were identical with the metal of a commercial electric blasting cap. As well, they found elements that are normally found after the explosion of an electric detonator. On September 23rd, 2 weeks after the bombing, the police brought Albert in for questioning. And the very next day, on September 24th, they charged Albert with murder. Just another little twist. The Crown prosecutor revealed during the trial that a few days before his arrest, Albert, who was at that point aware that the police were on his trail, accepted a $1,000 check from his Knights of Columbus council to go towards the cost of Rita's funeral and to console him in his bereavement. So now we go into the trials. Back in the 40s, trials were pretty quick. Albert was arrested on September 24th, and his trial was set to commence February 1950. The courts decided that it would be a closed trial open only to newsmen, law students, and officials. On February 23rd, the trial began, In the Montreal Gazette, they described the jurors, the 10 jurors. I'm going to read it to you because it's so not how we would speak today that it's just interesting. Quote, in order of their selection, the first 10 were Albini Fortin, dark, bespectacled industrial foreman; Donat Savard, a brisk little glove maker; Fortunat Hammond, labor foreman; Ernest Bilodeau, farmer; Noel Auclair, trucker; Paul Pouillat, a well-dressed forestry engineer, the jury foreman; Johnny Topping, a big farmer who speaks no English, which is strange in that he had the only English-sounding name; Charles Delaire, a mild-looking mail clerk; Jean-Baptiste Guimond, a dark little farmer; and Joseph Mainguy, electrician. These men and the 2 others still to be chosen will live in closed quarters on the top floor of the stone courthouse until the trial ends. Unquote. During Albert's trial, Marguerite testified that she had no idea that the package she delivered so carefully was a bomb, but she also admitted that she had purchased 20 sticks of dynamite for Albert in August, and Généraux, her brother, testified on March 5th that Albert told him the device he asked him to build was meant for blasting stumps on some future property at Sept-Îles, where Albert planned to build a home. Généraux also testified that when he was asking people how to make a bomb, Albert told him to tell people it was for killing fish at Lake Saguenay, which is not a real lake. Généraux claimed he was paid for the timer piece of the bomb with a ring worth $8 or $10. On March 14th, following a few weeks of testimony, the jury went to deliberate, and 17 minutes later, the door to the jury room opened and the jury came back into court. When asked what the verdict was, the jury foreman stood and said, "Guilty." Judge Albert Sévigné wept openly and, choking with emotion, immediately pronounced the death sentence. And as the sentence was read, Albert Gouet showed no emotion as he was sentenced by the judge to hang by the neck. As the judge was handing down his sentence, he told Albert, "Your crime has no name." As I said before, it would be years before the term terrorist would be brought into common use in the vocabulary. While Albert was in prison, he was hoping to get a reprieve on his execution date of June 23, 1950. And in order to get this, he made a deal. He turned on his accomplices and told the police that Marguerite and Généraux were in to bomb the plane from the very beginning. Once that deal was made, his execution date was moved to January 12, 1951. On June 6, 1950, Généraux was arrested at his rooming house and put in jail on a charge of murder. Généraux's trial began on November 27th, and 2 weeks later, on December 13th, he was sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. His jury was even faster in determining his guilt. They took only 13 minutes to find him guilty. And 2 days after Généraux was found guilty and sentenced, Marguerite was arrested and charged with murder. Marguerite had been acquitted of the crime of attempted suicide and released. On March 6, 1951, Marguerite's trial began. Her trial was just as short as Albert's and Généraux's, and on March 19th, she was sentenced to death by hanging. This time, her jury took 29 minutes to determine that she was guilty. She appealed that decision and was granted a stay of execution. On January 12, 1951, Albert was walked to the gallows at Bordeaux prison. As the hangman's noose was wrapped around his neck, Albert stated, "At least I die famous." And then the trap door was opened, and Albert paid for the sins of murdering 23 innocent people. Généraux was brought shortly before midnight on July 25, 1952. He was pushed up to the gallows in a wheelchair and hanged sitting down. On January 9, 1953, at the men's prison Bordeaux, Marguerite had been drinking. She sang a little ditty, "Take a shot, it's nice." Marguerite was escorted to the gallows by prison officials and nuns. And finally, she stated, "I never thought they'd get me." At 12:35 in the morning, a noose was strapped around her neck and the trap door was opened. She was the 11th woman to be hanged in Canada and the last. Even today, pieces of the wreckage of Flight 108 still litter the forest floor above Saut au Cochon. Some of it has been taken by souvenir hunters, but all of it has been disturbed since this horrible crime. The Saut au Cochon tragedy of Flight 108 on September 9, 1949, was the first attack against civilian aviation in North America. This was also the first domestic terrorist attack that ever saw a trial and conviction. My thoughts. I understand that it was the 40s, but you could have gotten a divorce in Ontario. They did do them. He didn't need to murder Rita, and certainly didn't need to kill 22 other people, innocent people who were just going about their daily lives. This guy was a piece of dirt. I find this story interesting because women being executed always seems to take on a different tonality with the public. For some unknown reason, and it's a curiosity to me actually, the majority of the public don't have a problem when a man is executed for their crimes, but when it comes to a woman, they view it a little differently. They view it as more of a rebellion of the norms. I guess it probably relates back to the old adage where men are supposed to be protectors of the women and women are dainty flowers, maybe. I don't know. I'm not a dainty flower, but I also am not going to murder anybody and be executed for it. There are many people who have written on this story who believe that Marguerite was innocent. Do I believe she was innocent? No. I think Marguerite and her brother knew exactly what was going on. Jean Auroux, her brother, was a good friend of Albert's, and I think the three of them conspired to explode the plane, although I think they thought they could get away with it because the woman in the Philippines had gotten away with exploding the plane with her husband on it. After doing all the research for this case, I believe they were guilty. Did they get their just rewards? Yes. They murdered 23 people. And for what? The root of all evil, greed. Albert was greedy to have his teenage lover become his wife. He was greedy that he wanted the life insurance policies on his wife. He had one from when they were married. He just had to buy another one that day from the vending machine. Was Marguerite greedy? No, but I think she was desperate to clear her name and clear the debt that she owed Albert. Knowing the way that Albert was, she knew she would never get out from underneath that debt. Jean Auroux? Was he greedy? I don't know. I think that he had very little regard for human life if he was willing to create a bomb and a timer mechanism in order to get a discount on a ring. This was a very tragic story, and the fact that the wreckage still litters the floor of the wooded area in Quebec is quite sad. I guess it's kind of a memorial marker for the tragedy that happened that day. I think all three of them had disregard for human life. As I always say, karma's a bitch, and when she comes back to get her payment, if it's you she's got her eyes set on, you're fucked. If you enjoyed this episode, please head over to our Patreon page. Show the Bitter Witness some love. For a few cents a day, you can support the show and help us to keep doing this and bringing you excellent episodes. And with that, I will leave you until next week. Enjoy your day today. This has been a Bitter Witness production.